Hello friends, my name is JJ, and the other day I found myself both outraged and darkly fascinated to see Sam Hyde having an extended chat about politics on his YouTube channel with Nicholas Fuentes. These are two deeply repulsive, ignorant men, as far as I'm concerned, but a lot of people seem to care what they had to say about politics, and their little chat got over 1 million views, which made it feel like an ominous glimpse of a disturbing new era of American political commentary, but also the logical culmination of certain trends from the last 3 decades. On this channel, I like to posit a theory that American culture is best understood in 32-year chunks, with us currently wrapping up a chunk that began in 1993 and ends in 2025. I call these years the Lesser 30 era, which followed the Great 30 era, which was from 1961 to 1993. And we call it the Lesser 30 because it sometimes seems like less happened in it relative to all of the excitement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But this isn't always the case, and today we are going to discuss a very culturally consequential phenomenon of the Lesser 30, the rise of political commentators.
To the right of people that I always thought were very conservative, like Kilpatrick.
Saddam's people were meeting with Kim Jong-il's people.
I think Republicans ought to jump on the rollout.
They're not really cutting ag subsidies.
Bill Clinton said about Obama when Hillary was running against.
Believe in the death penalty or not.
China did an attack on our country.
And the fact that his wife was actually born a man.
Also known as political pundits, political commentators are the men and women who make a living sharing their opinions on political news, either in newspapers or magazines, or books or blogs, or TV or radio, or on podcasts or YouTube channels, or live streams or social media, or big public gatherings. They talk about what's going on in the world of politics, about elections and politicians and social issues and public policy, and try to make convincing arguments about it all. It can be controversial to call these people journalists, just because they rarely do much traditional reporting or editing, and since their work is openly opinionated, they don't tend to respect traditional journalistic standards of neutrality or objectivity. But to the extent they often work for news channels or news websites, I think it's fair to call them a kind of journalist, but a mostly new kind that has only really become a ubiquitous part of American life over the last 30 years. So, let us take a closer look at how this phenomenon came to be, and how these people became some of the most famous, but also most contentious figures in American culture as we examine the history of political commentary in the era of the Lesser 30. When I left high school in 2002, I actually went to college to study politics with the intent of becoming a professional political commentator, which seemed like a reasonable enough ambition given the ever-growing number of political commentators working in the US and Canada at the time. Political commentators are fundamentally media people, so it's perhaps unsurprising that they thrived in an era where media itself was thriving. The early 90s to mid-2000s marked the final golden age of newspaper and magazine publishing on this continent, both in terms of circulation and profit. Talk radio reached a similar peak, with hundreds of new talk-based stations popping up on AM radio and later satellite radio, while television saw a comparable explosion of new channels following the introduction of cable and satellite TV, which most American households had by the mid-90s. These classic mediums all proceeded to precipitously decline in the 2010s and 20s, but their fall was easily offset by the rise of popular online alternatives like blogs, podcasts, and streaming video websites, all of which commanded equally large audiences. But no matter what the medium, opinion-based political commentary was always one of the most in-demand forms of content. Some of the Lesser 30 success stories in this regard were truly extraordinary and without precedent in American history. George Will, for instance, was probably the most popular newspaper pundit of the last 3 decades. According to a Media Matters study, circa 2007, his column was appearing in over 360 newspapers with a combined readership of over 26 million. Rush Limbaugh, the era's most iconic radio pundit, had his show broadcast on over 650 stations across the US, reaching over 15 million listeners until his death in 2021. On cable TV, meanwhile, Bill O'Reilly's commentary show on Fox News, The O'Reilly Factor, was the most watched thing on cable news for 16 straight years, from 2000 to 2016, averaging around 3 to 4 million viewers a night. In 2017, the New York Times reported that Ben Shapiro's political podcast was boasting 10 million downloads a month, which was around the same time that Cenk Uyghur's YouTube channel, The Young Turks, passed 3 million subscribers and 4 billion total views, which these days, of course, is not even that remarkable for a political YouTuber. Likewise, an enormous number of political pundits in the Lesser 30 wrote at least one book of political commentary that hit the #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list, including Michael Moore, Michael Savage, Rachel Maddow, Jonah Goldberg, Al Franken, Michelle Malkin, Mark Levine, and Jesse Waters, just to name a few. Several of these people churned out multiple #1 bestsellers, in fact. Now, why exactly America's appetite for political content was so voracious during this era is hard to attribute to just one thing. The Reagan administration's repeal of the so-called Fairness Doctrine in 1987 is certainly something that a lot of people fixate on. The Fairness Doctrine had been a post-war broadcasting law requiring all opinion commentary on American TV and radio to be balanced and even-handed, and the burden of obeying it was often claimed as the reason why mid-century American political commentary tended to be quite bland or conflict-averse. Repealing the doctrine was thus very freeing to TV and radio stations who could now air political content that put more emphasis on attracting audiences than being fair, which offered greater opportunities for commentary shows based around sharing opinions as opposed to conventional journalism. And of course, there was never even an attempt to enforce fairness on the internet, which was almost immediately deemed beyond the reach of government regulation one way or the other. A somewhat more mundane explanation for the political commentary boom, however, would just be that the last 3 decades have been very politically interesting, and this has fostered a lot of public interest in discussions and debates about political issues. In 1995, near the start of the Lesser 30, Gallup reported that only 23% of Americans claimed to pay very close attention to national political news. For the remainder of the era, the number averaged around 10 points higher, often in the 40% and up range. And why not? Among other things, this era of American history overlapped with 5 quite unpopular presidents: domestic terrorism, 9/11, wars against Afghanistan and Iraq, a global recession, Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party movement, the COVID pandemic, and endless debates over contentious social issues like abortion, LGBT rights, illegal immigration, and guns. It's fashionable to say that the last few decades have been an age of intense polarization in America, and a polarized political climate will naturally increase demand for public figures capable of explaining or embodying that polarization. Which brings me to the first of the 3 big trends that I think defined political commentators in the Lesser 30: partisanship. These days, it's hard to imagine a world where political commentators could be anything but partisan. We've become very used to the idea that anyone who talks about politics for a living is either broadly on the left or broadly on the right, and thus either broadly aligned with the Democrats, in the case of someone like Keith Olbermann or Brian Tyler Cohen, or broadly aligned with the Republicans, in the case of people like Cal Thomas or Charlie Kirk. President Trump has really leaned into this reality during his second term, giving a bunch of Republican-aligned pundits high-ranking positions in his government. But this wasn't always the case. In the Great 30 era, it was far more common for political commentators to present themselves as basically non-partisan, objective observers called on to analyze politics simply because they possessed a lot of knowledge about it, usually because they were Capitol Hill reporters or professors of history or political science. These were people who had spent a lot of time observing the world of politics in some professional capacity, and thus possessed a broad understanding of how the political system worked, who the relevant political players were, and what sort of scenarios were likely to happen in the future. More ideological pundits did exist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but they were mostly relegated to smaller niche publications like the righteously conservative magazine National Review, or some of the more radical left-wing publications that sprung up in the 60s and 70s. But none of these were very popular or profitable, and the idea of political commentary that was aggressively biased was mostly seen as kind of niche and eccentric, if not off-putting and extreme. But milder commentary was also a product of how many fewer media outlets existed in those days too. When there were fewer TV channels and radio stations and magazines, the content they put out tried to appeal to a broad and diverse general audience, which meant the most in-demand pundits were the ones who seemed the most uncontroversial, objective, and moderate. As the number of media outlets proliferated in the 90s and 2000s, this need to appease a general audience became less important, and the idea of a more partisan show or publication targeting a smaller but more ideologically predictable segment of Americans became a more viable business model than it had been previously. Now, where did this new crop of more partisan political pundits come from? Well, some still came through the traditional pipeline of reporting or academia, but overall their credentials became a lot more diverse. Some, like Laura Ingraham or Ann Coulter, were lawyers who had worked for partisan law firms. Others, like Dinesh D'Souza, Bill Kristol, or Van Jones, had served in a past presidential administration. Some were people who had gotten famous through their association with one side of a polarizing political scandal, like G. Gordon Liddy or Oliver North. A few were simply relatives of famous politicians like Michael Reagan and Meghan McCain. And in recent years, we've seen something of a comedy to commentary pipeline with people like Jimmy Dore and Dave Rubin. But many of the top pundits who emerged in the Lesser 30 were basically just guys like me who had trained specifically for the job of political commentator and nothing else. By the late 2010s, chances were high that any political commentator born in the 80s or 90s was probably just someone who had an interest in politics, liked watching or reading or listening to other political commentators, and were like, yes, this is the job for me. And maybe they'd been hired for this purpose at some newspaper, TV network, or radio station, or maybe they just plugged away on their own blog, podcast, or YouTube channel. Now, it's impossible to talk about the end of political media appealing to a general audience without also discussing the critical role that conservative activists in particular played in discrediting the idea that appealing to a general audience was even possible or desirable in the first place. One of the big narratives pushed by the American conservative movement, which consolidated a lot of power during the Lesser 30, was that media outlets and journalists who claimed to be neutral and objective were actually biased to the left. And the way this played out over the last 30 years was that a lot more out and proud conservative and Republican political pundits emerged promising to bring true balance to a media landscape that they said had been dominated for too long by liberals and Democrats. When Fox News first debuted in 1996, their inaugural slogan was fair and balanced, which became a bit of a punchline since from the start, Fox was known for employing almost exclusively conservative commentators who constantly attacked Democrats and defended Republicans. But their defense was that this was necessary to counter the left-wing bias of other media. This fixation with fighting back against liberal media is a big reason why conservatives tend to be overrepresented among the most famous and influential pundits of the Lesser 30. They had much stronger motivation and were part of a more coherent ideological project, and were thus more open about being at the forefront of this cultural shift towards bringing more aggressively partisan commentary to America. For much of the Lesser 30, there was actually considerable anxiety on the left that American progressives had been caught off guard by the right's project of assembling a powerful army of partisan commentators to persuade the public. You would often hear progressives call for a left-wing Rush Limbaugh, or a liberal Fox News, or more recently a Joe Rogan of the left. MSNBC's pivot to becoming an openly progressive network in the early 2010s and the rise of a number of prominent left-wing YouTubers and streamers later that decade did shift the scales a bit. But even online, conservative pundits like Tucker Carlson and Matt Walsh still seem to be pulling in the bigger audiences. In any case, even if the two sides weren't completely balanced, the partisan tone of political commentary remained equally fierce on both ends of the spectrum. More than any other issue, the dominant topic of political commentary during the Lesser 30 was mostly just why the other side is wrong, often expressed in the most harsh and strident way. It's easy to hate this kind of partisan combativeness, and certainly the shrill nature of political debate during the Lesser 30 was frequently denounced as culturally toxic.
Here's just what I wanted to tell you guys.
Yeah.
Stop. Stop hurting America.
Okay, now.
But it continued just the same, in part because it seemed to work. Political commentators were effective messengers and persuaders, which brings us to our next major trend, intellectualism. In sync with political pundits getting more partisan, the Lesser 30 also saw rising expectations that political commentators should be highly principled and organized thinkers with a very tight and ideologically coherent worldview. This reflected the fact that America's political parties themselves had become more ideological over the last 3 decades, whereas the Great 30 was defined by both parties having a mix of liberals, conservatives, and centrists. By the end of the Lesser 30, even the most conservative Democrat was still more liberal than the most liberal Republican, and vice versa. Partisan political pundits in the Lesser 30 were thus expected to function as competent theorists of either center-right or center-left political philosophy. Even more important than playing defense for their team, they had to be capable of articulating a comprehensive worldview, demonstrating why the principles motivating their side were more effective and just and compatible with human nature than those of the other side. Let me tell you about an episode that I think was quite symbolically important as far as the dual trends of intellectualization and partisanship go. In 1996, Fox News premiered a show called Hannity and Combs, with the gimmick being that Hannity was a conservative Republican while Combs was a liberal Democrat. This show is sort of forgotten about today, overshadowed by the much more popular solo show that Hannity got in 2009. But at the time, Hannity and Combs was seen as representing an important development in the evolution of professional political commentary into something more unapologetically oriented around partisan conflict. But what I find even more fascinating is how, in order to promote the show, Fox got Hannity and Combs to each write a book outlining their political philosophy. Combs was titled Red, White, and Liberal, How Left is Right and Right is Wrong, while Hannity's was called Let Freedom Ring, Winning the War of Liberty over Liberalism. And I've always found these books to be very interesting historical objects, just for how perfectly they embody this very Lesser 30 idea of expecting political pundits to be these deep political thinkers. Neither Hannity nor Combs had much education in political theory or philosophy, nor did they have any real-world experience in American politics. They were just guys who had spent a lot of time thinking and talking about politics, first on the radio and then on TV, and in doing so had formed strong and strict opinions about what government should and shouldn't do, and how American culture and society should be set up. And that was basically qualification enough for Americans to be expected to care what they had to say. Now, I don't want to come off as being too judgmental here. Forming an ideologically coherent theory of politics is not easy, and in a middle-class democracy, it would be elitist to presume the only people who should do this sort of thing are academics and politicians. A lot of political pundits of the last 30 years were sincerely perceptive and insightful thinkers, and undeniably played an important role in helping educate and enlighten the public about matters of real importance to their lives. But still, it is a remarkable fact that basically all of the best-selling books of political theory and argument that were published during the Lesser 30 were written by professional political commentators as opposed to, like, historians or economists. Glenn Beck's 2007 bestseller, An Inconvenient Book, Real Solutions to the World's Biggest Problems, for instance, is probably one of the most read political books in American history, Yet never before in American history did someone like Glenn Beck exist. Which brings us to the next theme: celebrity and entertainment. Every chapter of American history witnesses the arrival of new types of celebrities, and the Lesser 30 era was little different, with ultra-famous political commentators emerging alongside people like reality TV stars and bloggers as brand new categories of pop culture superstars. We talked earlier about just how popular many political pundits became during the Lesser 30, how many millions of Americans read their columns and watched their shows and subscribed to their podcasts. But as much as these people presented themselves as high-minded thinkers about politics and culture, by the end of the Lesser 30, I think it was becoming pretty undeniable that a lot of Americans also enjoyed their work as basically a form of entertainment, and often a pretty wild and lowbrow form. In the Great 30, there was definitely a stereotype that political commentary was very highbrow, dry, and frankly boring to anyone other than people who followed politics very closely, which, like I noted earlier, was a pretty small share of the population. If you watch old episodes of William F. Buckley's Firing Line, which was considered basically as feisty as political commentary shows got in the Great 30 era, it is remarkable how mellow and snobby it is.
This would yield higher revenues and give us precisely the situation that President Kennedy quite correctly anticipated in '63.
Strikes me as an elaborate, rather eloquent, but on the whole, unpersuasive evasion.
By the end of the Lesser 30, however, the exact opposite was true. Political commentary had become something very lively and entertaining that was very easy for the average American to enjoy, full of exciting conflict and drama between flamboyant, charismatic characters. Public debates, in particular, became more fiery and theatrical, from yelling matches between conservatives and liberals on TV, to conservative commentators going to college campuses and trying to provoke fights with liberal students, to loud and wacky political YouTubers screaming at each other on live streams. The appeal of watching this stuff was always heavily bound up with the fame of the people involved. Seeing a liberal debate a conservative was one thing, but seeing Jon Stewart debate Bill O'Reilly, now that's a must-watch. In a culture that had grown less fussy about qualifications, audience interest in political pundits frequently seemed to revolve primarily around how charismatic they were, whether they had strong partisan opinions, and whether they could hold their own amid ideological conflict. The problem, of course, is when these talents are the only qualifications for being a political commentator, things can quickly spiral in a very unserious and chaotic direction. And thus, in the 2010s, we started to see some really demented weirdos emerge as major stars in the world of American political commentary, like Alex Jones, Milo Yiannopoulos, Jack Posobiec, or Candace Owens, people who, while undeniably charismatic and engaging, also held incredibly fanatical and ignorant political opinions, buying into the most lunatic conspiracy theories about how the government is run by literal demons and stuff like that. A lot of the time, audiences seem to only take the opinions of these sorts of characters half seriously, claiming to mostly find them fun and provocative just because they're so shocking and fearless. They're obviously controversial, but American tolerance for controversy seems pretty high these days. And that sort of mirrors a broader trend in American entertainment more generally during the Lesser 30, where limits of taste and propriety were constantly being tested by movies and TV and music that sought to captivate audiences by being shocking or revolting or terrifying or bizarre in some unprecedented boundary-pushing way. Which brings us to today, where the lines separating political commentary from other forms of celebrity-based entertainment have never been more blurred, where old man Hassan Piker gets a thirsty profile in GQ, while people like Michael Knowles are brought out like pro wrestlers to give speeches before cheering auditoriums, and where you have 1 million people tuning into a political podcast between Sam Hyde and Nick Fuentes, two men who perhaps best embody just how hazy the lines have gotten, separating celebrities from commentators, and commentators from freak shows. The result is we conclude the era of the Lesser 30 in an America more filled than ever with people making a living, offering up their political hot takes, but also one with a public equal parts exhilarated and exhausted about inhabiting a culture where everything is political. So, I would be curious to know what you guys think about all of this. In your own lifetime, what are some of the trends in political commentary that you feel you've witnessed? And if you had to guess, how do you think political commentary will continue to change in the next 32 years? And as always, if you have any other ideas for lesser 30 studies, be sure to let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.